Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Betta Broad and really excited about the subject of our online teach-in today, transitioning off fossil fuels in the building sector and how to pay for it. We might not have all of the answers at the end of this hour, but this is obviously a really complicated topic, how we're going to decarbonize our buildings and pay for that transition. And it'll be an ongoing subject for us moving forward. But we're thrilled to have the speakers that we have with us today. They're really on the cutting edge of this movement, and Michaela is going to introduce them in a moment. But first, just a little housekeeping. I know that everybody's a Zoom expert by now, but just as a reminder, if you could put your question in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen on the right of your little tab there. And if you type in your question as we're going, at the end, we will do our best to field questions to our speakers, and whatever we don't get to, we'll capture in the Q&A and send around after with a recording. So don't worry if you have to go early or you're furiously taking notes, as I often am on these things. You can always watch later and be sure to get your question answered. So thanks again for being here. And yeah, I know there's a lot of exciting climate news happening at the national level, but we have our work cut out for us at the local. So I'll pass it off to Mick to introduce our speakers. Michaela?
Hey everyone, I'm Michaela Shabako, and really excited to have three very knowledgeable speakers today that could probably talk for an hour on their own, but we want to get a lot of high-level information. So yeah, I'm excited to introduce Amy Turner, who's the Senior Fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. She'll be walking through some gas bans in other states and what those municipalities are doing and what New York can learn from them. And then we have Nick Goldsmith, who is the Sustainable Coordinator for the City of Ithaca and Town of Ithaca, and he'll describe some of the cutting edge and innovative energy code supplements that Ithaca is adopting. And finally, we have Mark Thielking, who's the Director of Energy and Sustainability for the Town of Bedford, talking about decarbonizing existing buildings and how municipalities can pay for that transition, just like we do for our water and sewer infrastructure. So with that, I will hand it off to Amy to share your screen and get us started.
Great, thanks, Michaela. 1 second while I share my screen. This one. All right, can you see that, Michaela? Can everyone see that? Okay, great. So morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the whole New Yorkers for Clean Power team and to all of you for being here. I am here to give some background to the general policy that's come to be known as the natural gas ban, and to provide some legal context for how it might be carried out by cities and towns in New York State. I'm going to assume a very basic level of familiarity with the natural gas ban policy, but for those who are not familiar, a few dozen cities and towns in California have effectively banned natural gas from new buildings, and many more cities and towns across the country are interested in doing so, including, from what I understand, some cities and towns here in New York State. So, it's important to note that we're really at the very beginning of this in New York State. There are a lot of unanswered questions that are specific to New York, to the state and local legal context, but we can start to learn from how the policy has been implemented by local governments elsewhere. Let's see, next slide, how do I do this? So, just to kick us off, because I think it's always important to understand why we're talking about what we're talking about. Why do we want to ban natural gas, or why do we want to electrify buildings? Buildings account for about 40% of US energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, even more than that in some cities. So, significantly more than that in some cities. Building electrification is one of the three major components to decarbonizing the building sector. And new buildings are a really good place to start. Obviously, decarbonizing existing buildings is hugely important. But, at some level, we just have to say, like, okay, no new buildings that are connected to fossil fuels. And so that's why we start with electrifying or banning natural gas from new buildings. A couple of quick notes on terminology. First, when I talk about legal pathways, what I mean is this. It is a legal pathway is a law or set of laws and legal tools that can be used to advance an identified policy goal. So of course, the policy goal that we're talking about today is electrifying new buildings or transitioning new buildings off of fossil fuels. And one last note on terminology. So, you'll hear the term natural gas ban, you'll hear the term all electric construction code. A natural gas ban generally refers to the policies that attempt to prohibit or restrict connections to natural gas for new and often renovated buildings. So there can be a lot of exceptions, a lot of different ways that these policies are actually designed. It's really sort of an umbrella term that's meant to capture this policy. It's generally a new building policy, at least at this point in time. Some advocates and some city officials don't like the term natural gas ban. It sounds a little aggressive or it doesn't quite capture what they're doing. I use the phrase natural gas ban, but if it doesn't work in your municipality, feel free to say building electrification or restrictions on new natural gas hookups. One version of the so-called natural gas ban is the all electric construction code. And again, this is very broad terminology as well. It captures a whole range of code structures and requirements that can appear across different codes. They could require electrification or just incentivize it. So one thing to keep in mind here is that an all electric construction code is a version of the natural gas ban. These are functional equivalents. If you have an entirely electric building, then that building is not going to need to connect to natural gas. You've effectively banned natural gas. So there are two main legal pathways that we've seen at play in other states when local governments have either banned natural gas, electrified buildings, or attempted to ban natural gas. The first legal pathway relies on a city's inherent municipal home rule or police powers authority. This is a very general type of authority that allows cities and towns to regulate within their borders, to protect the general welfare and sort of manage their own affairs. So this is what Berkeley, California, which was the first city in the country to ban natural gas, did. They said, we are hereby regulating with respect to the general welfare of our community. We are banning new natural gas connections. The town of Brookline in Massachusetts also used the municipal home rule or police powers legal pathway, although unfortunately they did it unsuccessfully. In Brookline, Massachusetts, the state attorney general deemed the Brookline ordinance to be preempted by Massachusetts state laws. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when relying on a city or a town's home rule or police powers authority. Local laws can still be preempted by state laws that conflict. State law takes precedence over local law. I know I'm racing through this, but I've only got a few minutes to speak, and I'll make sure these slides get sent around. So the second legal pathway that we've seen at play for natural gas bans that have already gone into effect is the local building or building energy code authority. This legal pathway is available only in states where local governments have been delegated the authority to amend the building or building energy code, which is the case in California. And that's why this legal pathway has really taken off among local governments in California. They do have energy code authority. More than 36 of them at this point have passed building energy codes that either require or incentivize all electric construction. So I have just included like one of the, about 40 all electric codes that are now in effect across various local governments in California. There are a whole range of these policies. Some of them require electrification, some of them incentivize it, some of them are for residential, some are for commercial. You can sort of look at all of these different code requirements that are in effect and sort of choose what might be right given the building typologies that are in your community. So how does all of this apply in New York? We've got these two legal pathways. We've got, the inherent authority of a municipality through their home rule or police powers authority, and we have local building and code authority. So how do those apply in New York? First of all, the first legal pathway, New York is a home rule state. Cities and towns have relatively broad legal authority to govern with respect to their own communities, including this police power authority to regulate with respect to health and well-being. I've cited a piece of it here. Cities and towns in New York have long used their police powers to regulate with respect to the environmental impacts of buildings, including greenhouse gases and other air pollutants. So this legal pathway is a possibility for New York cities and towns. I think there is at least one significant unresolved issue. So I'm going to preview that before I go. But I think New York cities and towns do have this fairly broad municipal home rule and police powers authority to act. The second legal pathway is to update the local building energy code and building code to very strongly incentivize all electric construction. And this is also theoretically an option for local governments in New York State. There are two main codes that have to be considered: the statewide energy code and the building code, or what's often called the uniform code. So in New York, local governments have quite broad authority to pass energy code requirements that are more stringent than the statewide energy code requirements. So that piece of it is fairly straightforward. It's a bit more difficult for New York cities and towns to pass building code requirements that are more stringent than the statewide code. They actually have to petition a statewide board and sort of establish that there is a unique local circumstance that would require them to have this more stringent building requirement. So, if a city or town is able to draft an all electric code, or, maybe a net zero code, or another form of very stringent code that implicates only the energy code and not the uniform code, I think this is a pathway for local governments in New York State. I just want to state that I am not a code expert. I can't tell you how to draft an all electric code. I'm an expert in municipal authority to enact climate policy. So local governments would need to do a bit of work to draft a code that's consistent with these somewhat conflicting provisions of law. But I think the door is very much open to do that. So I promised to review an unresolved issue with respect to banning or restricting natural gas connections in New York State. And that comes in the form of the so-called utility duty to serve, or obligation to serve, it's also called. This is a state law provision that at one point was meant to protect utility customers by requiring the utility company to provide adequate service. So, you were sort of stuck with the utility company that was, granted authority by the state. And so the state put this consumer protection into the law, making sure that you were protected and could continue to get service. But it's causing some trouble now, though, when the goal is actually to phase out certain types of utility service. So, this slide shows the main duty to serve provisions in New York State. You'll have these slides, I think, after the presentation, so you can share them with your city or town attorneys. And, I think whether this language would actually preempt a natural gas ban really remains to be seen. It has not been tested in court in New York State. If what this language means is that no local policy can get in the way of gas utility service, then I would agree that it preempts a local natural gas ban, particularly if the police powers pathway is used. But I think there's quite a strong argument that this language doesn't say that. In other words, I think there's a strong argument that local policy that prohibits new natural gas connections, has nothing to do with the gas utility service or the continued distribution of gas. It would merely mean that fewer buildings would be asking for that natural gas service. But this is still very much an open point, and I understand that this obligation to serve is giving some heartburn to local policymakers, not only in New York State, but around the country where there are similar provisions in place. So I'm not going to read this slide. I understand the slides will be shared, so I just put this in here so that when you share it with your local attorneys, they'll have a fuller list of legal questions to think about. And I think that's all I have time for today. I think there's a lot of potential for New York cities and towns to figure out a way forward on this policy to either ban natural gas connections, new natural gas connections outright, or to pass, an all electric or maybe net zero building code. But there will be some level of legal experimentation here, particularly with respect to amending the Uniform Building Code and with the obligation to serve. So it will take, sort of an enterprising municipality who really wants to take this forward and develop the policy. So I think these questions could be overcome, and I hope to see some of your municipalities try that. And I'm going to pass this off to Nick Goldsmith now from Ithaca, who will talk to you a bit about some of the building decarbonization efforts that are in place in Ithaca. So I'll figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Amy. This is Nick Goldsmith. I work as a sustainability coordinator with the city of Ithaca and the town of Ithaca. And I'm just trying to get the screen share set up here. All right, great. Hopefully you're seeing my slide now. So I just want to say thanks to the organizers at New Yorkers for Clean Power. This is a really, really timely discussion in general, but also where we are at the city and the town of Ithaca, as you will see in a moment. So first of all, a tiny bit of context about our community. Our community as a whole and our elected officials are very supportive of and engaged in climate and equity topics. And the biggest and most recent example of that is both municipalities have adopted a Green New Deal that's aiming for an equitable transition to carbon neutrality by 2030. So that's community-wide. We've adopted some goals for our own operations too, but these are the most specific to today's conversation. So those are huge goals. How do we get there? Amy already mentioned how big of a role buildings play in overall greenhouse gas emissions. Locally, our buildings are responsible for more than 50% of our community emissions. So we're focusing, for a few years now, we've been working on this Ithaca Energy Code supplement, which is requirements for all new construction and major renovations. It would cover both the city and the town, the same requirements. And the requirements are laid out here on the slide. So immediately, we're expecting, I have a little bit more on this later on, but we're expecting to adopt this in the coming months, in a few months later this spring. Immediately would require a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at the building by building level. And that's compared to state code and local building practices. It lays on top of the building code, the energy code, all other New York State codes. So those are still in effect. Amy mentioned also specifically that municipalities can adopt a more stringent energy code. That's what we have here. We're not touching the building code purposely because of that heavier lift that Amy alluded to. In 2025, the requirements are slated to become more stringent, so requiring 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And then by 2030, we'd be requiring net zero greenhouse gas emission buildings and no fossil fuels. All right, there are two compliance paths for our policy. The easy path, which is sort of a prescriptive path, and there's something called the whole building path, which is more of a performance-based path. I'm gonna focus today on the easy path. This is a point-based system. So this slide just shows the basic areas of focus for the easy path. And you can see them listed here, the electrification, affordability improvements, renewable energy, and the other point is sort of a catch-all for 6 other points, which I'm gonna show you in a moment. I'm gonna show you the whole list. It's gonna be a little overwhelming on the next slide, so I'm just teeing it up right now. First of all, for calibration, each point is worth about 6 to 10% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And I also want to point out that because we've chosen this point-based system, it's less restrictive. So there's more flexibility for the building developer. And I think it runs into fewer hurdles for adoption too, because of that flexibility. We're not saying you have to install this certain type of technology, but you have to get to 40% reduction in emissions. Here's several ways you can do it. And Amy mentioned the 3 components of decarbonizing buildings. And this really hits all 3 in terms of promoting efficiency and renewable energy and electrification. So here are the points. I sort of grayed out the ones which are not directly applicable or as applicable to a fossil fuel ban. So the whole efficient electrification section obviously is very focused on moving space and water heating to efficient electric alternatives, mostly heat pumps. So for example, with a residential building, you need 6 points to comply for all buildings. For a residential building, you can almost comply if you just put in heat pumps. So if you put in a ground source heat pump system, you would get 5 points. And in addition to that, you'd most likely get point AI2 there under affordability improvements because your heating system would be in the heated space. What else to mention here? We're also focusing heavily on renewable energy. Obviously, you can get up to half the way towards compliance by using renewable energy, either on-site or off-site. And we've also got other points in here on reducing fossil fuels, like toward the bottom here, OP3 gives points for installing electric vehicle charging station infrastructure. It's a very high level view. I'm happy to go into more detail as folks want during Q&A, but I'm going to mostly stop there. But do want to mention that we're going to have a public comment period, probably the last one for this Ithaca Energy Code supplement opening today for the next several weeks. So you can find information about that at ithacagreenbuilding.com. The website's there at the bottom of the slide, and I'll be sharing these slides also. So I'm going to pass it over now to our next speaker, Mark Thielking, my friend and colleague, and thanks for listening. Bye.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you, Betta and Michaela, for inviting us to speak today. As Nick mentioned, it is a very timely topic, and we're focusing it here on the town of Bedford. Let me just see. Can you see my screen now? Great. All right. So, so I'm Mark Thielking. I'm the Director of Energy and Sustainability for the town of Bedford. I'm going to go a little bit in the weeds here. We've had a long history of reducing emissions here in Bedford. We got a lot of data. I wanted to bring that data back up to the New York State goals as it's expressed in the CLCPA, and then talk a little bit about our project that we've been working on, Amy, Nick, myself, Tina Carton in Saratoga, and the folks at Hudson Russ, on looking at these police powers, as Amy talked about, and how they might translate into a decarbonization policy that might work. So let me jump into town of Bedford. So in 2009, we completed a community-wide inventory of our emissions. This was using 2004 data. And we discovered that 68% of our emissions come from buildings, 27% from transportation, and 5% from waste. This kicked off a very concerted effort to reduce those emissions. We actually passed a resolution at the town level to reduce those emissions 20% by 2020. And with the formation of Bedford 2020 and the town working together, we launched pretty much, I'd say, every program to leverage either a NYSERDA program or utility program and get that out to our residents. So whether it was Energize Bedford or Solarize Bedford or launching our PACE program, we did a Heat Smart campaign, lots of composting and recycling measures, and we joined the Sustainable Westchester CCA. And obviously this was all to get going around how do we reduce our emissions, particularly in our building space, because it's such a huge percentage of our emissions back then. The result of that is that in 2019, we redid our inventory and we had a 44% reduction in CO2, which was pretty cool. We were pretty psyched about that. And the contributions came from buildings mostly. 66% of that reduction came from buildings, whereas the rest, from transportation and waste. But when we dug into the data a little bit more, we actually found out that we only reduced energy use in buildings 4%. So all that work, we reduced energy use 4%, which is, when you think about it, the economy grows 2% a year. This was a 13-year period. That's actually pretty good. But the real tailwind for our emissions reductions was the fact that our grids got a whole lot cleaner. The upstate grid that 2/3 of our community is part of reduced, got 64% cleaner, and the downstate grid got cleaner about 31%. So with that in mind, and the fact that we had, we did all that work related to reducing energy use in buildings and only got a 4% reduction, here we are in 2020. We just launched an 80% campaign by 2030. And yeah, we're behind you, Ithaca, but still, I think this is going to be a big job for us. 50% of our emissions now come from existing buildings. And what's interesting is the remaining fossil-based electricity, about 14% is in that mix, and fuel use, so what we burn in our buildings, is about 36%. Transportation is a whole nother story, and I think, Betta, we could have a whole other conversation around transportation, but we're not going there. But we've identified some pretty big problems heading into 2030 for us, and that is that 73% of our emissions in buildings come from fuel use. And this is a big deal. We burn a lot of oil, we burn a lot of gas. And we've learned over the last 10 years that voluntary action is really slow, it's expensive, and frankly, it's not equitable. It's, I would just say that a lot of more wealthy people were taking advantage of these programs. And yes, they have more efficient buildings, but to actually get beneath the 95% that didn't participate, it's gonna be a lot harder. And frankly, our buildings are really bad. So, and those are the basically takeaways. So if we move to the CLCPA, which, as you all probably know, this is the state law that was passed in 2019 that mandates quite a bit of reductions in emissions, a lot of renewable energy. I think the most important talking point, though, on the CLCPA is what's required in on-site energy savings by 2025. This is a huge number. It equates to essentially a 23% improvement across the entire building sector of New York State, which, again, equates to something like 67,000. I mean, if you were just to have a wave your wand and every building was 23% more efficient, that would work. Or the other statistic that I saw is that you would need to decarbonize, basically go to zero carbon in 1,600 commercial buildings and 67,000 residential units annually over the next 10 years. And 67,000 is like the city of Rochester every year. So that's like, this is really huge. So with that, again, as background, I wanted to jump into essentially what Amy, Nick, and I have been kind of working on with Hawks and Russ and with Tina up in Saratoga around, where does this police power, as Amy talked about it, or the way I look at it, public benefits as they are conferred to our residents today through laws, how does that maybe translate into decarbonizing our buildings? And what we learned really is that public benefits, such as safe streets, safe sidewalks, water quality, some things we take for granted, are happening because laws are mandating those things and services are being provided by local governments. So in the case of safe streets, the services are police services and street improvements. Safe sidewalks, these sidewalks are being improved by the city very often. Water quality, air quality, same thing. A lot of examples of how the public power of local action drives not only the mandate, but also services related to providing these components of civil life. So moving to existing buildings, how could this translate? And frankly, the way all these other public benefits that I was on the other slide, there was a harm related to what was happening in the citizenry. That's why a law was passed. So we now have quite a list of harms coming from local buildings, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution from burning home heating oil, obviously climate change threats. And the CLCPA, the state law, now actually creates a very nice case around how buildings are causing a lot of climate change threats. And then these other issues as well, all are coming from buildings that, as we all know, they're very old. In fact, I think New York State has the oldest building stock in the country. So can this work? And it seems like it can from our research. I think what's important for us too is that we wanted to look at some analogs, and we thought the clean water analog was probably the best one, where state legislated mandates and local laws drive the local services that provide the public benefit of clean water. And there are other state and federal mandates as well, which come on top of that. But again, it's about a local government with very broad powers saying we need to fix something in our community that takes action, and then that action happens through services. The other big piece that's really instructive around clean water is that there is a state authority called the Environmental Facilities Corporation, it's EFC for short, that provides assistance to local governments to carry out these public mandates. So when a city or a town is violating a state law, say for sewage or for drinking water, this state authority actually provides a lot of assistance. And not only that, they provide financing for that community to improve their system. And I wanted to bring this back to Bedford because we had a very serious situation about 10 years ago. Our drinking water was being contaminated by lots of, 100 years of sewers and septic, I should say. 100 years of septic have basically contaminated our wells. So our town decided about 10 years ago to take out debt from the Environmental Facilities Corporation to build a water filtration plant. That debt allowed for about 2,100 Bedford connections to connect into this new clean drinking water and not have to rely on polluted wells. I'm paying about $700 a year on my tax bill for that clean water because I live here in the town of Bedford. It's about 10% of my tax bill. And I also pay a separate water usage fee. But now we got clean water. And of course, I can't live in a community without clean water, right? So if we translate that to a potential similar effort around high performance buildings, again, thanks to our Energize Bedford experience, to improve our buildings for about 30% efficiency, it costs about $12,400 on average. If you were to, again, apply that investment across the community, all 2,100 housing units, it would turn into about a $1,000 per year on the tax bill payment. And again, for most of us, that would be probably covered by the savings from that 30% savings. And again, it's just an example of how maybe clean water with the state support from the Environmental Facilities Corporation issuing really, really cheap financing applies to maybe high performance buildings in an infrastructure. The other big thing to remember here is that clean drinking water is available to everybody. That is a right by the local law that requires clean drinking water. Similarly, this high performance building upgrade process would be available to every building as well. This is not about credit quality. It's not about being wealthy or even owning your building. This applies to every single housing unit because it's a public benefit. So I wanted to bring the lens back out again and look at New York State's needs, which are pretty big. 7.6 million housing units. If you just look at the single family home and 1 to 4 attached units, that's about 5 million units. If you were to assess them to see what the need is related to decarbonization and efficiency, it's about $2 billion of capital that's needed. If you were to upgrade them just using our Bedford number, which probably isn't accurate, but let's just use that for example, the $62 billion need of, which it seems like a big number, but EFC, the Environmental Facilities Corporation water facility at the state, has issued $37 billion worth of water financing over the last 30 years. And obviously the firepower is there to issue very similar levels of financing to upgrade our building stock through the water model that exists. So again, I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to wrap up now because I know we want to get to questions, but in short, what we've learned is that essentially legislating public benefits at the local level, plus state support to accommodate that local action can be very, very effective, certainly happening in water. It also ensures rapid implementation. So our water treatment plant got up and running in about 2 years. It ensures equitable application, which is a really key component. Right now, up till now, the more haphazard, voluntary approach to improving our building stock really relies on good credit and lots of incentives. That does not apply in the water model. Everyone receives benefits of clean water when there's a public benefit activity going on. It's a very clear market signal as well. And we all know that with large scale, it does reduce costs. And this would be massive. $60 billion is not a number to think it's small. And then of course, all these other components are part of this potential when it comes to, again, marrying the local government action to a state infrastructure like what's happening in clean water. So I'll pause there. I know it's time for questions, and these are some of the questions that have come up in my last presentations, but Michaela and Betta, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Amy and Nick, also for running through so much information in a short amount of time. And so I'm going to quickly just talk about a couple of our take actions so quickly before we get to all of the really great questions. And so I'll share my screen. And I also want to put the link to our take actions in the chat, so you can also just view it there. But we have 4 different take actions today for energy efficiency and decarbonizing buildings. One is to sign in support of our input to NYSERDA for their new New York stretch energy codes to make buildings cleaner, safer, and more efficient. So you can just sign there. And then another is a template to send a letter to your supervisor, mayor, town board, city council, to adopt NYSERDA's most recent current New York stretch energy codes, Energy Code 2020. And these recently have been attached to grant funding through the Clean Energy Communities program of up to $50,000. Among all these other benefits that you can learn more about, I attached a fact sheet and the place to find more information in that letter, along with a contact. And then we also have 2 events that you can attend next week. One is the Get Off Gas Rally and Press Conference that is on Tuesday at 3 p.m., where Renewable Heat Now will basically ask the PSC to come out with their gas planning proceeding white paper that aligns utilities with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And another is to engage in New York's climate future by attending the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council. They have a public engagement session next Thursday at 3 p.m. and they'll present their proposal for the Climate Action Council, and you will have the opportunity to have input on that. So all of that is on our website, and again, I put that link in the chat. So check it out, and please sign, send, and attend next week. And I will pass it to Betta to start us off with some of the questions.
Great, thanks Mick, and thanks to all our wonderful speakers. A ton of information to cover in a short time, and I appreciate the flurry of activity in the chat and all of the great questions that are coming into the Q&A. So I guess just going to the first one, Amy did touch on this, but just if we want to kind of revisit some of the legal issues related to municipalities passing gas bans on new construction, Amanda points out that based on their discussions with New York State officials, NICOM, conducting their own research, only the PSC can regulate natural gas usage and installation, and municipalities are preempted from regulating gas service installation, which I know you touched on, Amy, but just wanted to raise it again in case there was still some lingering questions about how that would work. And then also just related to that is a question from Tom about, or a point, that we should also be banning propane and fuel oil in addition to gas, and especially because they cost more to use. So thank you, Tom, for pointing that out. And then one more question to throw in here, and then I'll let Amy take these away. But do all electric codes exclude solar thermal heating or geothermal heating? So Amy, do you want to tackle some of those points?
Sure. With respect to that first question, I mean, yeah, look, state law definitely controls here. I think it's a question, I think some of these questions have not yet been fully sort of worked out, and particularly have not been tested in court. So, you know, I mean, I think the very conservative position is that, you know, PSC regulation or PSC law sort of controls here. But I do think there are some very real questions around, you know, whether a building related requirement would interplay with gas gas distribution such that public utilities law would be, preemptive here. I think you have to sort of think about whether there's an argument to be made, and I think there is, about differences between, behind the meter and in front of the meter. So, these are definitely complicated questions, and they have not been fully worked out. State law could definitely throw a wrench into this whole thing, particularly if you're thinking about municipalities acting unilaterally, but I don't think that it's an open and shut case. I think there's a very strong argument to be made by a municipality that, what it's doing by either banning natural gas or requiring all electric construction is fully behind the meter and has, nothing really to do with the public utilities law. Other questions had to do with, sorry, Betta, there was one about propane and other forms of fossil fuels. Certainly, in developing a code that could certainly play a role and would probably, have something to do with, local, local conditions and what the city or town decided was most important and advantageous to go after. Do all electric codes exclude solar thermal heating or geothermal heating? No. Every code would be drafted differently. So, there's no one code to look at and give a straight yes or no answer, but certainly, renewable forms of power would likely be strongly encouraged in an all electric code.
Thanks, Amy. And I should say that, one strategy is certainly to pursue changing the public service law. So that is something that we're hoping will happen in order to enable municipalities to act more freely in this regard.
If I could, there are several questions about state law.
Yeah.
So, as a general matter, like state law could kind of fix all of this, right? Like if you passed, if you got rid of the statewide obligation to serve, if you changed the public utilities law, if you had a statewide building and building energy code that required all electric, then municipalities wouldn't have to act to do this. And so there's certainly value to doing state level advocacy to change these laws. There's also value in doing home rule petitions and other sorts of resolutions to have these laws passed locally at the state level. So, yes, definitely the number of folks that have mentioned in the chat and in the Q&A that, these things could be fixed at the state law level. That's absolutely true, and certainly worth keeping the pressure on, in parallel with these efforts to pass these sorts of policies locally.
Let's see, Simon Strauss has a question. Can a natural gas ban be made more palatable economically for the utility by using the existing gas infrastructure on a, say, block by block cooperative basis for a district heating cooling network, thus usefully reusing gas infrastructure instead of leaving the utility with stranded assets, and B, providing an efficient district infrastructure that is GG efficient and more cost-effective than individual building infrastructure. And something that we have explored on past online teach-ins. We could also send a link around to that one that we did last summer on district, but I don't know if anyone, Mark, if you want to chime in, or Nick.
I don't have a lot to say about this. I mean, I do agree that district heating and cooling is really worth looking at. We did write in provisions that allow for district energy in our Ithaca Energy Code supplement, and for a very good reason. Cornell University, one of our main commercial entities, has a district energy system and has for several years. I don't know the feasibility of reusing any of the infrastructure, so I'm not going to speak to that.
Yeah, I don't have a view on reusing infrastructure either, but I know that the power of local action through local laws can craft something that would marry up very well with that. So in other words, I just gave an example of how we might want to retrofit our homes here in Bedford, but in fact, maybe another city would rather just pass a law that gets a district heating system going for a community. And that's the power of this police power. When there is a harm, you can start to really move on some very specific, very local actions that cure the harm.
Thanks, Mark. Let's see. I mean, again, there's a lot of questions about going back to the issue of states kind of acting unilaterally. I'm not sure whether you touched on this directly, Amy, but Eleanor Peck has raised that our attorney found if the city were to enact a ban, it could be sued on the grounds that it's a state matter, not a local matter. I'm not sure if you addressed that directly in your presentation or you want to comment on it, but I know that that is a concern that municipalities have given what's happened in California.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question is, would you be sued and would you be successful in that litigation? And those are two different questions, right? So, the gas industry is very well organized and very well funded with respect to this issue. It's existential for them. So, a city or town who tries this might be sued. And one of the arguments that will be made is that the local government is preempted by the state government. Like I said, I think there are arguments why local governments are not preempted in New York State. They have this energy code authority. I think there's a way to sort of split the preemption by the PS public service law that sort of looks at the difference between behind the meter and in front of the meter, whether a building requirement effectively prevents or gets in the way of the obligation to serve. Like, I think there are very strong arguments why it's not preempted at the state level, but yeah, I mean, I would not be surprised to see a municipality get sued over this. And one of the arguments made would be that this is a state law question.
Thanks, Amy. And we'll let people know if we have pro bono legal help for municipalities that are willing or interested in pursuing that strategy. We'll definitely keep you posted on that. But going into a more specific question for Nick, how does Ithaca's energy code compare with the New York stretch code? What are the similarities and differences?
Thanks for that question. I know it's from Amanda Mazzoni. I got into a little bit of trouble the other night for speaking too much about the New York stretch code and saying some inaccuracies. So I'm not going to try to sort of compare them line by line. We fully support the New York stretch code. I know a lot of municipalities are thinking of adopting it, including Mark's municipality, the town of Bedford, including some local ones around here. We wanted to support that, and for that reason, we include compliance with the New York stretch code as part of the energy code supplement. So you can get 1 or 2 points, depending on if you're a commercial or a residential building, by complying with all those requirements. I think one difference is just that it's the energy code supplement has closer to a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and in the stretch code, I think it's a much lower level, but that's not to say that it's not by itself very useful. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Nick. And as we point out in our Take Action, according to the new Clean Energy Communities opportunity that was just released, I think yesterday, towns can get up to $50,000 for grants for passing or adopting the stretch code. So that is exciting. Also, if people are interested, we can provide some draft language that would be the stretch code plus electrification ready, which is something that towns could move forward with, and that you wouldn't have to risk potentially getting sued as you would for passing a gas ban, but it would be a really big step in the right direction as far as encouraging or requiring electrification ready. So let's see, I don't know if we want to do another follow-up question about the energy code from Tom. Would they need state board approval if another town wanted to use your energy code, Nick?
I think the answer is yes. So what, and I feel like I saw this in the chat somewhere, or maybe Amy mentioned it specifically, but basically we can, once we adopt the energy code supplement, we can submit it to the state because it's just, relating to the energy code and not the building code. It is a much easier lift, so they have to approve it, but it's much easier to do. I think every town or city would have to follow that same process of submitting their policy to the Department of State and just getting approval on that. Amy, please correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah, if it's an energy code update, then it needs to be submitted to the State Department, and as long as they find that it's more stringent than the state level code, then they'll approve it. And you can start enforcing it sort of right away. If it's a building code or a uniform code improvement, it's more complicated and you have to show this unique local condition. But Ithaca is an energy code.
And I could speak to our efforts to customize the stretch code, where our customizations basically drifted into the building code side, not the energy code. And we were advised that would be a very onerous process. So there is this, I don't know if it's a bright line or if it's a not so bright line, but it is a question. And that's where attorneys definitely come in, local attorneys.
And Nick, I saw that you just answered a question about renewable natural gas. If it's a part of your 6-point system, could you just answer that for everyone?
Sure. So the question was, is renewable natural gas allowed as renewable energy? And the answer is no. So we're actually just covering under the renewable energy point, we're covering solar, wind, and renewable electricity. There's also a point for biomass space heating systems, sort of a separate point, but we don't address renewable fuels at all. So it's really renewable electricity or biomass heating.
Housekeeping question, is it possible to share the Q&A as well as the presentations? Yes, we generally try to capture all of the questions, and then the ones that we don't get to, we ask our generous speakers if they could provide more information, or we just, answer questions that we can ourselves, and then we circulate that after with the recording. So we will do our best to do that because there's a lot of great questions, and we do, try not to go too much beyond the hour, but we have still lots of good questions. One from Pete Sikora. Do you happen to know if the authority New York City relied on for the clean heat program was code, more general powers, or public health authority? Any idea, Amy?
I think that was for me. Yeah, I don't know offhand. Sorry, Pete. If you want to email me the program you're thinking of, we can talk about it offline.
Okay. And one from Bernie, Bedford has not outlawed gas connections. I believe Bedford doesn't have gas, right?
We do have gas. We have about 10% of our housing stock uses natural gas. We're at the end of the line.
Okay. But you're clearly pursuing the stretch code, and were you also considering a ban on propane and fuel oil, other fuel oil, or?
So we're not actively contemplating that yet, because a lot of what we thought we needed to do was related to this project that we were working with Amy and Nick and Saratoga on. Is like, what are our powers to do all that? And does it make sense to do this unilaterally, meaning with just the town powers we have, or would it make sense to do this in a more comprehensive way in partnership with the state? And I think, again, I think what we've learned is that from the perspective of human health and certainly climate change, there's a lot of local power that could be put to bear here on reforming how our existing buildings sort of heat themselves. So I think we're at that point now where we're going to make some next steps. But again, working with Amy and working with Nick and the rest of the group, it really gave us perspective on where our boundaries are around what we could do related to heating fuels.
Thanks, Mark. And we're very excited to see this concept continue to evolve and what the next steps will be and how we can support it. A question from Evelyn Wright. Have any munis looked at options to impose a carbon tax or energy tax and use the funds to do these building upgrades? Probably another question for Mark, but anybody could chime in if they have the answer to that one.
Yeah, that's a state law question.
Yeah, right.
You need state law authority to do that.
Yeah. So I think what we did talk about, though, was the ability for local governments to raise revenue to provide services that might, again, move towards decarbonizing buildings. And that gets pretty tricky. Again, and this gets really in the weeds, and we have 2 minutes left, but one of the reasons why the EFC model is so attractive is that there are ways around the tripwires in raising funds and providing services to local buildings, right? And that's why, like, again, the water model is so great. So without spending 20 more minutes, that definitely deserves more more research. But again, the water model offers a really good path potentially.
I'll just add on to that quickly. Excuse me. Looking at the last part of that question, use these funds to do building upgrades. I think there might be opportunity for that through community choice aggregation, where you're doing basically a bulk energy purchasing for your entire community and hopefully at a savings. And I believe that we can pull aside a little bit of that money for programs like doing building upgrades. So that might be another avenue.
Great. So let's see, we have like 1 more minute and so many good questions. And let's see, our last question. Albany Mayor's Sustainability Advisory Committee urged city to adopt New York State stretch code. The stretch code is revised every 3 years. The current code is not in line with global urgency. Is there a process to advocate for much more stringent codes in future cycles? Well, funny you should ask, Mark, because one of our take actions, actually the very first one, is aimed at putting comments into NYSERDA, because right now they are developing the next phase of building codes. So we have several kind of suggested comments, but you would be free to put in your own individualized comment as well. And we'll be sure to send around that link, but it's also in the chat. And we also, to someone else's question about help with the New York State stretch code, we also have that link in our take actions as well. We really do want to encourage people to adopt the stretch code, as well as push for more ambitious codes in the future. And of course, we can provide some draft language if you want to pursue an electrification ready stretch plus, I would say.
I'd just like to respond to Mark Schaefer's question. You know, there is the option to add in other energy code related restrictions into your stretch code. So, you know, for sure, if you feel like the New York stretch code is not doing enough for your community, you have the option to add in more restrictive components.
I would also add, I know we're 1 minute over at this point, there's an interesting model out there in Massachusetts right now. There's sort of sweeping climate legislation that's in the Massachusetts state legislature right now, and it would include a municipal net zero opt-in stretch code, which is new for Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a stretch code sort of similar to New York stretch in that it prioritizes efficiency improvements, but this would actually go all the way to net zero if it's successful. So, you know, that could also be a model for New York to pass a municipal opt-in net zero stretch code in connection with state law.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, so it's 1:02. I don't know, we could take, if you guys want to take a couple more questions, we can, or we can just wrap up. I don't want to be greedy with people's time.
I'd like to answer Adam Flynn's question.
Okay, yes, please.
And you know, he asks, what stage is this concept at? And frankly, it's really just at the conceptual stage. But we are talking to many of the Climate Action Council members and the panels just to create this idea that there is a large scale, but would take lots of state legislation to address existing buildings. And I believe it's getting some good attention. And in fact, I would suggest to Adam and everybody else, if you're interested in this idea, I'm happy to continue to promote it in the sense that just getting the word out that there is another model out there, how water and sewer benefits are promulgated across the state in a very cost-effective and equitable way. Why not apply that to existing buildings too? So happy to continue to raise awareness around that.
And we will be hopefully working with you on that, Mark. And I should also mention our last take action is to attend the energy efficiency and housing panel where they're seeking public input next Thursday at 3 o'clock. So this is something that could be raised there. I believe you already presented to the panel about this concept, Mark, but I'm sure hearing from more people that they're excited about this, that they think it's important, that, you know, it is a public good, a public benefit, and that we need to support municipalities in decarbonizing our buildings. So that's another opportunity to take action and participate in the Climate Action Council process that's going on. So any other kind of last thoughts or questions that we want to address now before we wrap up? Okay.